Behind Buckingham Palace's gilded gates, centuries of tradition govern every move, and silence speaks volumes. A king navigating his reign, a stepmother's daughter pushing boundaries, and a storied jewelry collection spark tension. This is not merely about diamonds and pearls. It is about power, loyalty, and the clash between private desires and the unyielding demands of the crown. The letter, according to sources close to the palace, arrived without warning, not a public decree, not a press release carefully worded by communications staff, just a firm, private instruction delivered through the appropriate channels. The kind of message that in royal circles carries the full weight of a king's authority without ever needing to raise its voice. King Charles III had made his position clear. Laura Lopes, the daughter of Queen Camilla from her first marriage, had allegedly been seen wearing and, according to certain insiders, quietly acquiring pieces from Camilla's extensive, personal jewelry collection, items whose origins, history, and institutional significance placed them well beyond the reach of casual inheritance. And now, the king had stepped in. It was, those close to the situation would later describe, a masterclass in quiet royal authority. No public scenes, no dramatic confrontations, just the unmistakable clarity of a monarch drawing a line and making absolutely certain that line would not be crossed again. But to understand why this moment mattered so deeply, why it sent ripples through the inner chambers of the palace and reignited long-simmering questions about loyalty, legacy, and the boundaries of royal belonging, you have to go back. Back to the jewelry itself. Back to Camilla. Back to a monarchy that has always understood that its greatest power does not lie in its armies or its wealth, but in its symbols. The British monarchy is, at its core, a living museum. Every crown, every brooch, every strand of pearls carries within it a history that stretches across centuries. These are not merely ornaments, they are declarations. They are proof of lineage, of sacrifice, of the extraordinary weight that comes with wearing a crown. Royal jewelry in Britain operates within a carefully constructed framework. Some pieces belong to the crown itself, held in trust for the nation and passed from sovereign to sovereign, regardless of personal preference or family feeling. These are known as crown jewels or crown property, and they are as much a part of Britain's constitutional identity as Parliament or the rule of law. But then there's another category entirely: personal jewelry. Pieces gifted, inherited, or acquired by individual members of the royal family throughout their lives. These items occupy a more ambiguous space, legally and emotionally. They belong to the person, not the institution, and yet when that person is a queen consort, when those items have been worn at state banquets, photographed at coronations, and linked by the public imagination to the monarchy itself, the line between personal and institutional becomes extraordinarily difficult to draw. It was precisely in this gray zone that the drama surrounding Laura Lopes began to take shape. King Charles III is a man shaped by one of the longest apprenticeships in royal history. He waited more than 7 decades to wear the crown his mother carried with such enduring grace. And in that waiting, he developed something that perhaps only comes with extraordinary patience: a profound and almost architectural understanding of what the monarchy is, what it requires, and what it must never allow itself to become. He is not, those who know him insist, a cold man. He is deeply sentimental. He weeps at music. He writes letters by hand. He speaks to his garden as though it might answer. But he is also, when the institution demands it, a man of absolute resolve. Camilla, now queen consort, arrived in the royal family, carrying the scars of a love story that had divided a nation. For years she was viewed with suspicion, even hostility, by a public that adored Princess Diana and could not easily forgive the woman they held partly responsible for the collapse of that fairy tale. She endured, she waited, and slowly, with patience and a dry wit that eventually disarmed even her harshest critics, she found her place. Her jewelry collection reflects that journey. Some pieces were gifts from Charles, private, loving gestures exchanged across decades of a complicated romance. Others were inherited from her own family, the Shand lineage, carrying their own quiet history. And some, crucially, were items that had moved within the royal orbit long enough to carry a significance far beyond their monetary value. Laura Lopes is Camilla's eldest child from her first marriage to Andrew Parker Bowles. She is warm, personable, and by most accounts devoted to her mother. She has navigated the peculiar social position of being a stepchild to the King of England with what observers describe as considerable grace. She is not a working royal. She holds no title. She lives a life that exists at the edges of the monarchy, close enough to feel its warmth, but never fully inside its walls. And that position, it seems, is precisely where the trouble began. The question of what happens to royal-adjacent jewelry when the person who owns it is also a queen consort is not a new one. It has surfaced before, in previous generations, and it has rarely been resolved without friction. When a woman marries into the monarchy, particularly at the highest level, The gifts she receives, the pieces she wears, the items that become associated in the public mind with her role. All of these begin a slow process of transformation. They stop being simply personal property and start becoming something more complicated. They become part of the story, part of the record, part of what future generations will look back on when they try to understand this particular chapter of royal history. For Camilla's children, Laura Lopes and her brother Tom Parker Bowles, this creates a genuinely difficult emotional reality. These are their mother's things. They watched her wear them. They remember seeing them laid out on a dressing table or fastened at a throat before a grand occasion. They carry the ordinary, intimate weight of a parent's belongings. But the palace sees something different when it looks at those same items. It sees history. It sees precedent. It sees the potential for pieces that belong within the royal record to quietly slip away into private hands, and with them, a fragment of institutional memory that can never quite be recovered. This tension between a family's natural, loving impulse to hold on to pieces of a parent's life and the monarchy's institutional need to preserve and protect its own legacy is where the drama found its ignition point. To understand why King Charles responded with such particular firmness, you have to understand something about where he is emotionally and personally at this moment in his reign. In early 2024, Charles received a diagnosis that changed everything: cancer. The specific details were kept in the tradition of royal privacy, carefully guarded, but the announcement itself, the fact that a reigning monarch had stepped back from public duties to undergo treatment, was seismic. What followed was something that surprised even seasoned royal watchers. A bond formed, quiet and profound, between King Charles and Catherine, Princess of Wales, his daughter-in-law, who was herself navigating her own devastating cancer diagnosis at almost exactly the same time. Two members of the same family, facing the same terrifying uncertainty, finding in each other a kind of solidarity that cut straight through the usual formalities. Those close to the family describe it as one of the most genuinely moving developments of Charles's reign. He reached out to Catherine with a tenderness that spoke not of duty, but of genuine human feeling. He understood what she was carrying because he was carrying something similar himself. And that experience, that brush with mortality, that sudden clarifying confrontation with what truly matters, sharpened something in Charles. It deepened his sense of what legacy means, what continuity means, what the monarchy owes not just to the present, but to everything that came before and everything that will come after. It is in that context that his response to the jewelry situation becomes fully legible. This was not merely an administrative concern. It was, for Charles, a matter of profound personal and institutional conviction. The specifics, as reported by sources familiar with the palace's inner workings, center on a collection of pieces that Camilla has accumulated across her decades in the royal orbit. Some of these items are straightforwardly personal gifts, family heirlooms, pieces purchased privately, but others occupy that more complex middle ground. Among the items of concern, according to those sources, were pieces that had been worn at significant royal occasions, photographed extensively in the public record, and in some cases gifted to Camilla specifically in her capacity as a member of the royal family, rather than simply as an individual. Laura Lopes, it is alleged, had been seen wearing some of these pieces, and there were questions, pointed, pressing questions, about whether certain items had been, or were in the process of being, quietly moved out of the palace's sphere of awareness. The palace's position, communicated through those careful, private channels that the monarchy has always preferred to public confrontation, was unambiguous. Items of royal significance, regardless of who wore them last, regardless of personal feeling or family expectation, must remain within the institutional record. They are not simply possessions to be distributed. They are artifacts of a living history. For Laura Lopes, this was not simply a legal or administrative matter. It touched something deeply personal. These were her mother's things, items that carried her mother's fingerprints, her mother's perfume, her mother's story. The idea that an institution could reach in and declare authority over them felt, from her position, genuinely painful, but the palace was not asking for feelings. It was asserting a principle. King Charles, those close to the situation report, handled the matter with precisely the kind of calm authority that defines his approach to difficult family situations. There was no anger, no public rebuke, no dramatic gesture designed to humiliate or exclude. There was simply clarity, through the appropriate intermediaries. Because in royal circles, almost everything of real consequence is handled through intermediaries. The message was delivered to Laura Lopes. The items of institutional significance were to be accounted for. Their status was to be clarified. And going forward, any questions about Camilla's collection about what could be passed to family, what must remain within the royal record, and what occupied the complex middle ground between the two, would be handled through a formal, structured process overseen by the palace itself. It was, in the language of royal protocol, a firm but gracious correction, the kind that acknowledges the human feelings involved, while leaving absolutely no room for misunderstanding about where the authority lies. Royal commentators who have observed Charles across decades of public life note that this is, in fact, one of his most distinctive qualities as a monarch. He does not wield power loudly. He wields it precisely. He understands that the monarchy's greatest asset is its dignity, and that dignity is best preserved not through dramatic confrontations, but through the steady, unhurried exercise of institutional authority. He is his mother's son in this regard, one experienced royal correspondent noted, speaking on background. The Queen never shouted. She never needed to. And neither does he. Within the palace's extended orbit, the response to Charles's intervention was described as one of quiet relief. There had been, sources suggest, a growing unease about the trajectory of events. A sense that, without firm guidance, a situation that was already emotionally complicated could become institutionally damaging. Royal historians point out that disputes over jewelry and personal property are far from unprecedented within the House of Windsor. The question of what belonged to the crown and what could be considered personal property has surfaced in nearly every generation, sometimes with consequences that echoed for decades. The most famous precedent, perhaps, is the controversy that followed the abdication of King Edward VIII in 1936. The question of what property Edward could take with him into exile, including jewelry of considerable historical significance, created a dispute that strained family relations for years and was never entirely resolved to everyone's satisfaction. Charles, steeped in that history, was determined not to allow a similar ambiguity to take root in his own reign. He had watched what happens when institutional clarity is sacrificed in favor of personal accommodation. He had seen how those concessions, made in the name of kindness or family feeling, have a way of expanding, of setting precedents that become impossible to walk back. His intervention with Laura Lopes was, in this sense, not just about the jewelry. It was about establishing early and unambiguously the principles by which his reign would operate. As of the time of this telling, the situation has not fully resolved itself. The process of reviewing and cataloging Camilla's collection, distinguishing between pieces of purely personal significance and those that carry institutional weight, is understood to be ongoing. Laura Lopes, for her part, has maintained a public composure that those close to her say masks a more complicated private reality. She remains devoted to her mother. She remains, by all accounts, a warm and engaged presence in Camilla's life. But the episode has introduced a new awareness, a sharper understanding of where the boundaries of royal belonging actually lie, and what it truly means to be adjacent to a crown without wearing one. There are questions still unresolved about the longer-term disposition of several items, about who will ultimately have custodianship of pieces that carry Camilla's personal history alongside their royal significance, about how the palace will balance its institutional obligations with the very human desire of a mother to leave something meaningful to her children. These questions will not be answered quickly. In royal circles, almost nothing is. But they are being asked, carefully and deliberately, within the structured framework that Charles's intervention has now established. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with wearing a crown. It is the loneliness of being the person who must hold the line. Not because you do not feel, not because you do not love, but because you understand, at a level that goes beyond the personal, that some things are larger than any individual feeling. King Charles III is a man who has spent his entire life preparing for a role that demanded he eventually become that person. The patient son, the waiting heir, the man who loved deeply and lost publicly and endured and adapted, and finally, at an age when most men are thinking of quieter things, took on the full weight of an ancient crown. The jewelry drama involving Laura Lopes is, in one sense, a small thing, a family disagreement about possessions, the kind of friction that erupts in ordinary families every day, usually, without anyone outside the household ever knowing. But inside the walls of a monarchy, nothing is entirely small. Every decision carries the weight of precedent. Every gesture is read for meaning. Every instance in which a king draws a line becomes part of the record, part of the story that future generations will examine when they try to understand what this reign stood for, and what it chose to protect. What Charles chose to protect in this quiet and determined way was continuity, the belief that the monarchy is not simply a family but an institution, a living thread connecting the past to the future, holding within its custody the symbols and artifacts that make that continuity visible and real. He did it without anger, without spectacle, with the calm, unshakable authority of a man who has finally, fully, stepped into the role he was always meant to inhabit. and in doing so, he reminded everyone watching, inside the palace walls and beyond them, that in the House of Windsor, the crown does not merely sit upon a head, it speaks, and when it does, the room goes quiet.